Welcome to the Brains Concept Studios podcast, Open Mic. Today, we're diving deep into a question that's been making headlines and sparking some serious debate. Should social media be held responsible for all the misinformation out there?
Yeah.
It's a tricky issue with real-world consequences. And honestly, it impacts all of us who scroll through our feeds every day to help us untangle this knot. We've got an expert with us who's been following this debate closely.
It's definitely a hot topic, and for good reason. Misinformation has always been around, but social media has changed the game completely, making it spread faster and wider than ever before.
You know, it's funny you say that, because I was just reading about the whole yellow journalism era.
Yeah.
Back in the late 1800s. Newspapers were basically the social media of their time, right?
Absolutely.
And they had a huge influence on public opinion, I was reading about. How those sensationalized stories might have even played a role in pushing the U.S. into the Spanish-American War.
Wow.
Imagine that. A war sparked by exaggerated claims in the news.
Yeah, it's a stark reminder that the power of media, for better or worse, isn't a new phenomenon. And as technology evolves, so do the ways we grapple with misinformation. After the yellow journalism era, we saw the rise of radio and television. And with that came new regulations. The government stepped in with things like the Fairness Doctrine, which tried to ensure balanced reporting by requiring broadcasters to present different sides of controversial issues.
Right, like the whole equal time rule I've heard about.
Exactly.
But those regulations were mainly for traditional broadcasters, right?
Right.
How did things shift when the internet came along?
Well, the internet changed everything. With the explosion of platforms like Facebook and Twitter, suddenly anyone could publish their thoughts and reach a global audience. And that's where Section 230 comes in, a law that's been at the center of this whole debate about social media's responsibility.
Okay, so for those of us who haven't gone to law school, can you break down Section 230 and why it matters so much in this context?
In a nutshell, Section 230 says that online platforms aren't legally responsible for the content their users post. It was created back in the 90s to encourage innovation and free expression online. But it's become a major point of contention. Critics argue that this protection lets social media companies off the hook too easily, allowing misinformation to spread unchecked.
So it's kind of like saying, hey, we're just the stage, not the actors.
Right.
Don't blame us for the bad performance.
Right.
But with social media, the stakes seem so much higher now, right?
Absolutely.
We're not just talking about bad reviews, but things like election interference and false information about public health crises.
You're absolutely right. The potential for harm is immense, and that's why this debate is so heated. There are strong arguments on both sides.
I'm all ears. Let's dive into those arguments. What are the main reasons people believe social media platforms should be held accountable for the spread of misinformation?
One of the key arguments is that these platforms have become so powerful, they're basically the new broadcasters. They reach billions of people and have a huge influence on public opinion. Just like traditional media outlets, some people believe they should face consequences for spreading harmful falsehoods.
So it's like if a news network knowingly airs a false report that ends up hurting people, they can be held liable. Why should it be different for social media giants? It's interesting how the lines are blurring between traditional media and these online platforms.
Exactly.
Another big argument is that social media algorithms, the systems that decide what content you see, are often designed to keep you engaged, even if that means showing you sensationalized or misleading stuff.
Right.
And then there's the sheer volume of content. They're dealing with billions of posts and comments every day.
It's true.
I remember reading about those leaked documents from Facebook, which showed they knew their algorithm was promoting divisive and potentially harmful content, but didn't do enough about it. That whole situation was a big wake-up call for a lot of people.
It certainly raised some serious questions about transparency and accountability. Critics argue that without stronger regulations, social media companies are basically incentivized to prioritize profits over truth. And they point to real-world harm. Things like COVID-19 vaccine hesitancy fueled by false claims, and the violence we saw at the Capitol riot, which was partly organized on social media. It's hard to ignore the potential consequences.
It's definitely a complex issue with a lot of gray areas.
Yeah.
But I know there's another side to this argument, right?
Right.
What are some of the reasons people push back against holding social media platforms responsible for all this misinformation?
Well, one of the biggest concerns is the potential impact on free speech. Critics argue that social media is a vital public forum, where people should be able to express themselves freely without fear of censorship. They worry that if platforms are held liable for every false statement, it could lead to excessive restrictions on what people can say or share online.
It's that classic balancing act, right?
Yeah,
Trying to protect free expression while also preventing harm. It's not an easy line to draw.
exactly.
And another point they raise is that, unlike traditional publishers, social media platforms don't create the content themselves. They're just providing a space for users to share their thoughts and ideas, which inevitably includes some misinformation.
Right.
Holding them responsible for everything posted, they argue, would be like holding a phone company responsible for every conversation people have on their phones.
That's a good point.
That's an interesting analogy. So they're basically saying, hey, we're just the pipes, not the water. But couldn't that also be seen as a way to avoid taking responsibility for the kind of environment they're creating?
It's a valid point. And that's why some people are calling for Section 230 to be updated or even completely repealed. They argue that it's outdated.
Yeah.
And doesn't reflect the reality of how social media works today.
It sounds like Section 230 is kind of like the elephant in the room when it comes to this whole debate.
Yeah.
But what about the argument that giving governments more power to regulate online content could be risky?
That's another big concern. Opponents worry that government intervention could lead to censorship and the suppression of dissenting voices. They point to countries with authoritarian regimes, where misinformation laws are often used to silence critics and control the narrative.
It's a slippery slope argument, right? Like, where do you draw the line? Who gets to decide what's misinformation and what's not?
Right.
It's a lot of power to put in anyone's hands.
Exactly.
And there are practical challenges, too. Even with the most advanced technology, content moderation at this scale is a massive undertaking. Platforms are dealing with billions of posts and comments in countless languages, and it's impossible to get it right all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah, even with all the AI
Yeah.
and fancy algorithms, it seems like there's a human element that's really hard to replicate. It's not like you can just flip a switch and filter out all the bad stuff.
It's a nuanced and messy process, and critics worry that relying too heavily on automated systems could lead to mistakes, with legitimate content being removed and harmful content slipping through the cracks. It's a tough balancing act.
And I imagine there's a whole other dimension to this debate about personal responsibility.
Absolutely.
Like, shouldn't users also be accountable for what they choose to believe and share?
Many people argue that promoting media literacy is crucial. We need to empower individuals to be critical thinkers and savvy consumers of information.
So it's not just about what the platforms do, but also about how we as users engage with information online. We need to learn how to fact check, evaluate sources, and be aware of our own biases.
Exactly. It's about building a culture of informed skepticism and responsible sharing. If we all take those steps, it can make a huge difference.
It sounds like there are no easy answers here. This whole debate is incredibly complex.
It is.
But speaking of complex, I'm curious to hear more about some of the key figures who've been shaping this conversation. I'm thinking about people like Mark Zuckerberg and Elon Musk. Their actions and opinions carry a lot of weight.
You're right. They definitely play a significant role. Let's start with Zuckerberg, the CEO of Meta, which owns Facebook and Instagram. He's been in the hot seat for years, facing criticism over how his platforms handle misinformation.
I remember all those congressional hearings where he was grilled about Facebook's role in the 2016 election and the spread of fake news.
Exactly. His stance has consistently been that they're a platform, not a publisher, and therefore shouldn't be held liable for what users post. He argues that they're doing their best to combat misinformation through fact-checking initiatives and content moderation. But it's a constant battle.
And then there was that whole whistleblower situation with Frances Haugen, right?
Why?
She leaked all those internal documents. That painted a pretty damning picture of Facebook's practices.
Her revelations in 2021 really shook things up. The documents suggested that Facebook knew more about the harms caused by its platforms than they were letting on. But they often prioritized profits over user safety.
That's a tough pill to swallow. It makes you wonder how committed they really are to addressing these issues.
It certainly raised a lot of eyebrows and added fuel to the fire for those calling for greater regulation.
So where does someone like Jack Dorsey, the former CEO of Twitter, fit into all of this? He always struck me as being a bit more thoughtful and introspective than some of the other tech CEOs.
Dorsey has definitely taken a different approach. He's acknowledged the need for greater transparency about how algorithms work and has even advocated for more decentralized social media models.
So he's more open to the idea of rethinking the entire system rather than just tweaking the existing one.
It seems that way. He's expressed concerns about the concentration of power in the hands of a few big tech companies and has suggested that alternative models might be necessary to address the challenges of misinformation.
That's a pretty radical idea. But then you have someone like Elon Musk, who seems to be going in the complete opposite direction with his takeover of Twitter, which he renamed X.
Musk is a fascinating and often controversial figure. He's a self-proclaimed free speech absolutist and has rolled back many of Twitter's content moderation policies, arguing that the best way to combat bad speech is with more speech.
So he's basically saying, let the marketplace of ideas sort it out. But doesn't that ignore the fact that misinformation can spread much faster than accurate information and have real-world consequences?
That's the critique many people have. They worry that his approach will create a more hostile and toxic online environment and make it even harder to combat the spread of harmful content. Only time will tell what the long-term impact of his policies will be.
It's a fascinating, albeit a bit scary experiment to watch unfold. So we've talked about the arguments, the key players, the challenges. But what about potential solutions? Is there any hope of finding a way out of this mess?
There are a lot of smart people working on this problem, and there are some promising ideas on the table. It's not about finding a single magic bullet, but rather a combination of approaches.
All right, I'm ready for some optimism. What are some of the solutions people are proposing?
Well, as we mentioned earlier, amending or even repealing Section 230 is a major point of contention. Some people believe that updating or getting rid of this law would force platforms to be more accountable for the content they host.
But wouldn't that also open them up to a flood of lawsuits and potentially stifle innovation?
That's the concern raised by those who oppose this approach. It's a delicate balance between protecting free speech and ensuring that platforms take responsibility for the harms caused by misinformation. Another idea that's gaining traction is increasing transparency around algorithms.
Okay, so instead of trying to regulate the content itself, we could shed more light on how these mysterious algorithms work.
Yeah.
I'm all for a little sunshine on this whole process.
Exactly. The thinking is that if we understand how these algorithms prioritize certain content, we can better address the problem of misinformation being amplified and spread so quickly.
But wouldn't that also require social media companies to reveal their secret sauce, their competitive advantage? I can't imagine they'd be too thrilled about that.
It's definitely a challenge. Platforms are understandably reluctant to give away their trade secrets. But proponents of this approach argue that the public interest in combating misinformation outweighs those concerns. There are also ideas about using AI more effectively to detect and flag false content, but that comes with its own set of challenges.
Right, like the potential for bias.
Yeah.
And the difficulty of teaching machines to understand nuance and context. It's not as simple as just letting robots decide what's true and what's false.
Exactly. Human judgment is still crucial. And we have to be careful not to create systems that are easily manipulated or that end up silencing legitimate voices.
That's what you're saying is, this isn't just a technological problem, it's also a human problem.
Precisely. Technology can be a powerful tool, but it's only as good as the people who design and use it. And that brings us back to the importance of media literacy. We need to equip individuals with the critical thinking skills to navigate this complex information landscape.
It's like we need to teach people how to be digital detectives, or
Exactly.
how to spot the red flags, verify information,
Yeah.
and not fall prey to clickbait and emotional manipulation.
You got it. And that involves not only knowing how to fact check, but also understanding how algorithms work, how to evaluate sources, and how to recognize our own biases.
It sounds like a tall order, but I also find it kind of empowering. It means we're not just helpless victims in this whole misinformation game. We have agency, we can learn how to play the game smarter.
Exactly. We all have a role to play. In creating a healthier and more informed online environment, it's not just up to the platforms, it's up to all of us. It really is a collective effort. Think of it this way. Each of us is like a node in a vast network, and the information we choose to amplify or debunk has ripple effects.
So it's like we're all responsible for maintaining the health of this information ecosystem.
Yeah.
That's a pretty powerful thought.
It is, and it can feel overwhelming at times, especially when you see how much misinformation is out there. But even small actions can make a difference.
Okay, so let's get practical. What are some things our listeners can do right now to be more discerning consumers of information and avoid falling prey to misinformation? Give us the toolkit.
First and foremost, be skeptical. Don't just accept everything you see at face value, especially if it comes from sources you're not familiar with. Always ask yourself who's sharing this, what's their agenda, what evidence are they providing.
So it's like putting on your detective hat and looking for clues.
Yeah.
What are some red flags that should make us pause and dig a little deeper?
Sensational headlines or overly emotional language are often designed to grab your attention and bypass your critical thinking. Look for signs of bias, like a website that only presents one side of the story or uses loaded language. And always check the sources. Are they credible? Are they providing verifiable evidence?
It's like that old saying, consider the source. But with so much information coming at us from all directions, it can be hard to know where to even start. What are some good strategies for verifying information?
Fact-checking websites like Snopes and PolitiFact are great resources. They debunk common myths and rumors circulating online. You can also do a quick search to see if other reputable news outlets are reporting on the same story. If you're only seeing it on obscure websites or social media accounts, that's a red flag.
It's like cross-referencing your sources, just like you would for a research paper.
Right.
But let's be real. Sometimes we see something online that makes us so angry or outraged, we just want to share it with everyone we know. How do we resist that urge when our emotions are running high?
That's when it's especially important to take a step back and breathe. Misinformation often preys on our emotions, fear, anger, outrage, because those emotions make us more likely to share something without thinking critically.
So next time I'm about to fire off that angry tweet or share that shocking article, I need to ask myself, am I being played?
Exactly. And it's not just about being cautious about what we share, but also being mindful of how we engage with others online. If someone shares something that seems questionable, resist the urge to jump into a heated argument. Instead, try to have a respectful conversation. You might be able to point them to some credible sources or help them see the issue from a different perspective.
So it's less about winning an argument and more about helping people become more informed and critical thinkers. It's like we're all in this learning process together.
I think that's a great way to put it. We all make mistakes. We all fall for misinformation sometimes. The important thing is to be open to learning, to be willing to change our minds when presented with new evidence, and to create a culture of respectful dialogue online.
This has been such an insightful deep dive. Thanks for helping us navigate this complex and often confusing landscape. Before we wrap up, is there any final piece of wisdom you'd like to leave our listeners with?
If I could offer one takeaway, it would be this. You have more power than you think. You're not just a passive consumer of information. You're an active participant in shaping the online world. Every choice you make, from the sources you trust to the content you share, makes a difference.
That's a powerful message. It's a reminder that we all have a responsibility to be informed, to be critical thinkers, and to be part of the solution.
Exactly. And remember, it's an ongoing process. There's always more to learn. And the landscape of misinformation is constantly evolving. But by staying curious, still informed, and staying engaged, we can navigate these challenges together.
This has been an episode of the Brains Concept Studios podcast Open Mic. Be sure to like, follow, subscribe, and share this episode for more content. We'll catch you on the next deep dive.